How are you today?
I'm doing great, Alexandra. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. I again would like to say thank you for you to coming on. Very excited to learn about you and what you do. And I think most importantly is to find out a little bit more about Hashimoto and thyroid. So I'm really looking forward to it. So let's get started. So my first question to you would be, if someone doesn't know, what is Hashimoto?
Sure, it sounds like an exotic, rare Japanese sword fighter, right? It's Hashimoto's, but it's actually a very common condition affecting potentially 1 in 5 women in the Western world. And what it is essentially it's an autoimmune condition that leads to inflammation in the thyroid gland, which eventually leads to hypothyroidism. People typically might go to their doctors and hear that they have slow thyroid, low thyroid, sluggish thyroid, hypothyroidism, and they may not be told that it's actually due to Hashimoto's, this autoimmune inflammatory attack against their thyroid gland. And so many of them think they just need thyroid hormone and don't realize that there's whole autoimmune component. So Hashimoto's is the leading cause of hypothyroidism in most of the Western world. The other causes are primarily going to be like having your thyroid removed or radiation. So majority of the women, I would say 90 to 98% of the time that are walking around with hypothyroidism actually have Hashimoto's.
Hmm. Hmm. So why do doctors do not roll out that this is Hashimoto? Is this something that they're not aware of, and they're not looking into it, or they're not, like, what's going on with that?
Well, the standard medical approach to Hashimoto's or hypothyroidism is basically when the thyroid gland is damaged enough and it's not able to produce thyroid hormone, it's to
Right.
give people replacement thyroid hormone. And so for them, no, whether you have Hashimoto's or not doesn't really matter because they're not going to really do anything about that inflammation
Mhm.
against the thyroid gland or the inflammation that's happening in the body or the autoimmunity. Now, the challenge is that a lot of times people get their thyroid hormones optimized with medications, but they still have a ton of lingering symptoms. And this is due to the autoimmune response. This can actually be measured by thyroid antibodies,
Mhm.
which are markers we can measure on our blood to see if this attack against the thyroid gland is happening.
Right. So what really inspired you to start your work in the field of health and wellness? And can you tell us about your journey and how you became an expert of thyroid health?
My I was inspired by my mom to become a healthcare professional. So she was a medical doctor in Poland. And I remember just going into her clinic. It was next door to our house, believe it or not. Going into the clinic and helping her with patient care and going to the pharmacy with her and doing all of these things with her. My dad was in the States when my mom and my brother and I lived in Poland for many years. And I just always knew I wanted to help people with their health. When I got to high school and college, I realized how much I liked chemistry and how much I was intrigued by little substances that can just really have a profound impact on our physiology. It really wasn't interested in the thyroid gland during pharmacy school. I thought it was pretty basic. If somebody has a thyroid condition, you just give them a pill for that.
Mhm.
And really, it wasn't until I got diagnosed myself with Hashimoto's that I started to understand that there's a lot more going on in it than just getting the hormones right. And
Right.
so this is how I became, a Hashimoto's expert. The thyroid pharmacist slash human guinea pig was just trying to get myself better. I have
Right.
had a lot of symptoms in my 20s and um, probably started around age 18, 19, and progressively I just got more and more symptoms.
Mhm.
And getting on thyroid medications, getting that diagnosis, that was helpful for me, but I still had 95% of the same symptoms left. And it wasn't until I got into lifestyle changes and how tiny substances like foods and
Mhm.
tiny, chemicals in nutrients and supplements, I realized that those were just as powerful, if not more powerful than medications in a lot of cases.
Right. Right. I think also food is very important to manage certain diseases or certain autoimmune diseases. It's very, very important. How do you approach balancing traditional medicine and alternative, or maybe perhaps a holistic approach in your work? Do you use that in your practice?
I do. So when I trained in functional medicine, one of the teachers said, keep an open mind, but not so open that your brain will fall out. And there's a lot of healing modalities out there outside of medications that can be incredibly helpful. And then there are some healing modalities that just really don't move the needle. Maybe they're nice to do, maybe they're not harmful, but they're not really going to be the needle movers and may just be time consuming and expensive to do. And then there's those modalities that can harm people, right, if you utilize
Right.
them. And so I really try to differentiate between that for people that I work with, and in my own, I guess, research, I try to look at what's going to be the most safe thing, what's going to be the most helpful thing for people to do, and what are some things that can potentially cause harm. And I found a lot of times, optimized thyroid hormones. Yes, we do need to do that for many people when their thyroid gland is sufficiently damaged or they don't have a thyroid gland. They do need to be on some kind of thyroid hormone in many
Right.
cases. But getting just the right amount and getting the right kind of thyroid hormone is kind of where the art and science meet. And this is very relevant for a lot of people. And then I really try to focus on the evidence and what are some unique patterns of that individual that we can address. So for example, the evidence shows that a lot of people with Hashimoto's and hypothyroidism might have low vitamin D, and getting that vitamin D balanced can help people get into remission and feel better. And so I'll always, rather than saying like everybody should be on vitamin D, I'll always say this is something that we need to test for because it's very relevant for a lot of people, and optimizing it can make a big difference. But we're not going to just give it to everybody because high levels of vitamin D can be toxic as well. And so I kind of
Right.
go through all of the different evidence like that. And of course, drawing on my own experience and experience with people that I've worked with.
Yeah. So, um, which thyroid test basically do you recommend for people to take? For example, here in Canada, it's a little bit difficult because doctors, to be honest with you, refused. Once they look at the numbers or look at the panels and they see certain numbers, um, if you go and ask them, I would like to, I really feel I'm not feeling well, and I would like to have my, for example, my T4, T3 or TSH done. They kind of refuse to do your blood work. Uh, so it's like you need to go and find a private practice to have these thyroid hormone tests done. So what would you recommend for people go and do? Like in terms of, no, it doesn't matter if it's public or it's a private clinic, but what are the most important tests that they have to have it done to make sure that the thyroid is running right or correctly?
So my family has this joke that whenever I go somewhere, I give people hypothyroidism, right? Or I give them Hashimoto's, because I always find people will have all the symptoms, but their doctors won't do the right tests. And then I will encourage them to get the right testing done. And sure enough, their testing, if you do the right testing, you'll actually find that you have a thyroid condition and you can do something about it. Um, it's kind of backwards, to be honest with you, because doctors will typically test the TSH, which is thyroid stimulating hormone, and it's a pituitary hormone that essentially gets elevated when we don't have enough circulating active thyroid hormones, which are T4 and T3, just for the whole picture. And honestly, this test can be off because a person's pituitary and body might not have a great connection. And so that TSH number can be normal, even though people might have those low levels of circulating thyroid hormones. And then the other thing is, for the first 5-10 years that a person has Hashimoto's antibodies, which is like that marker that your immune system is attacking your thyroid glands,
Mm-hmm.
they might have a normal TSH, or their TSH might be fluctuating. So one day it might be high, one day it might be low, one day it might be normal. So it's kind of a luck of the draw if you test it on the day that it happened to be elevated. So that's essentially, you will see Hashimoto's antibodies as an earlier indicator of thyroid illness than you will the TSH test. And doctors will say, if you have an elevated TSH, I'll test your thyroid antibodies.
Mm-hmm.
But it really shouldn't be that, because they should say, I'm going to run a full thyroid panel. I'm going to run your thyroid antibodies, TPO and TG antibodies, run a TSH, and then I'm also going to run free thyroid hormones, free T3 and free T4. And then in some cases, people might have kind of stress-induced or nutrient deficiency-induced hypothyroid symptoms, where all of those numbers might be normal, but their reverse T3 might be high. So I would add that to a panel when you're screening for symptoms. And just to give you an idea, people can have significant symptoms when they have elevated thyroid antibodies and their TSH still falls in the reference range. So they might have brain fog, they might have anxiety, depression, they might have multiple miscarriages, and a whole host of, people are like, oh, you're more tired. Why are you more tired? Or they might think that there's something wrong with them and see a psychiatrist, when in fact, they just need to address the autoimmune component and potentially get on a low dose of thyroid hormone.
Right. So the best way is to basically say to your doctor, I really need those tests done. And if not, I think, especially here in Canada, just go private.
I think, every healthcare system is different. So I've worked with people from around the world, in Canada, US, Australia, Poland, the UK. And what's worked for some of my clients to get that through, more of the traditional doctors, or perhaps public doctors that are in other countries, because in the US we don't have a public healthcare system, which is a topic for another day. But I typically say it helps if you mention that you have a family history of it. So, or I had been exposed to Chernobyl, and so it helps if you mention that you've been exposed to Chernobyl, because we know that there's going to be higher rates of Hashimoto's antibodies with that
I
kind
have
of.
Too. I was probably about 6 or 7 years old when that happened. Yeah. Where are you from? From Poland?
Ukrainian border. I grew up in Lublin and a tiny town called Hostinne, next to Hrubieszów.
Okay.
How about yourself?
Katowice.
Okay, yes.
Yeah.
Very
so
nice.
I'm kind of in the middle, but I remember they used to make us drink the iodine. Anyways, I remember that. But okay, let's get back on the subject here. So obviously, the impact of the environmental factors such as pollutant and toxin have a huge impact, obviously, on thyroid, right? And as we talked about a little bit earlier, diet and lifestyle also is huge. What would you recommend for people basically who are just finding out that they're having this autoimmune? What would you suggest for, like, where can they start, for example, to take their health into your own hands, or at least talking to their primary doctors, or even contacting you, or like, can you share that with us?
The great place to start for a lot of people is the gluten-free and dairy-free diet. This can get some people completely into remission, and a lot of symptoms can go away with that. If they do need some kind of thyroid hormone support, I would say if they're highly symptomatic, trying to conceive, if their TSH is above 10, then perhaps talking to their doctor about getting on some thyroid hormone. Oftentimes, doctors might prescribe levothyroxine or Synthroid, which is the T4 hormone. However, the more active thyroid hormone, T3, is something that tends to work better, and not everybody is able to utilize T4 properly to make their own T3, which is what supposedly happens for at least on paper. And so a lot of times I'll find people do better when they have a T4 and T3 medication combination. And then really, like, I have found nutrient deficiencies are very common in people. So a lot of times I might recommend selenium and myo-inositol as a great place to start testing their vitamin D, testing their ferritin and B12, and getting those addressed is a great place to start. And also, there some of the patterns that I typically see are going to be toxic load, they're going to have some kind of stress dysfunction, and they're also going to have some sort of gut issue, whether that's a gut infection or some inflammation in their gut. One of my most popular books is the Hashimoto's Protocol, and this goes through a program, a 90-day program that people can typically do on their own, of course, being supervised by their doctors, where they will do a 2-week protocol just focusing on the health of their liver to try to move out some of those toxins. I used to, I'm very nerdy, so I like to do a lot of functional medicine testing. And I used to recommend a ton of different tests to see what exact toxin people had and so on and so forth. And that can be very time consuming and expensive. But just getting on a really solid liver support can be great for clearing out 80% of the toxins. And a lot of people, in my experience, about 80% of people will feel better in 2 weeks just by supporting their detox pathways. And then going through the process, the rest of the book goes into things you can do to support your stress response and your gut health. We can go into some of the details if you'd like, or focus on one of the protocols.
Yeah,
Whatever.
no, I would like to talk about your first book, and then the second book too, because your second book just came out as well, right? A couple months ago. So
I
I would
have
love to hear about that.
I have 4 books. So I have the Hashimoto's Root Cause, which is a research-based book on all of the different causes of Hashimoto's. The second book is a Hashimoto's Protocol, which is a 90-day plan. Then I have a cookbook with recipes for Hashimoto's, and then the latest one is about adrenals and
Okay.
how to rebalance the stress response. So I think most people know about my Hashimoto's Protocol book because it's the most popular one.
Yeah. So in in one of your cookbooks, are you using mostly what kind of diet should people be on when they're having Hashimoto's?
Definitely a big needle mover for people is a gluten-free diet and dairy-free diet. Oftentimes I'll recommend eliminating soy. There's a lot of arguments around that. My experience has been that it can drive up Hashimoto's antibodies and inflammation. If people find that they're more anxious when they're consuming soy related products, that could be it. That could be a marker of your antibodies. And then blood sugar balance is another key component of getting those antibodies stable and feeling significantly better, losing weight if you need to. The blood sugar component is focused on definitely less carb intake and more protein and fat intake compared to the standard American, standard Western diet.
Right, the said diet, yes. Yeah.
And
And so let's say if someone is, again, I'm not pointing fingers at anybody which diet is better or not, but let's say someone is struggling with thyroid or Hashimoto, but they're vegans. Can they, for example, still, let's say, eliminate all the gluten, but let's say they really want to continue being vegan for whatever reason? Is that still feasible, or this is something that they would have to look into changing their diet or be at least open to the idea of adding animal protein into their lifestyle?
so I tend to be diet agnostic where I don't care what kind of diet people eat. I just find that whatever that makes them feel the best is what I care about as a healthcare professional. And I appreciate that people might be vegan for a lot of reasons. However, unfortunately, I haven't found that diet to be particularly helpful for Hashimoto's. In fact, I have a lot of people who used to be vegan and they go to more of like a paleo type diet, and that's what they needed to get their Hashimoto's into remission. So I would love to say you can stay vegan and you'll be fine, but I wouldn't be um, I wouldn't be doing you any good if I were to tell
Right.
you that. Majority of the time, people do need to introduce some animal protein. I will say, I think some people might be able to still stay vegan if they do a lot of supplementation, such as omega 3s and carnitine and B12 and iron. But it just becomes a little bit too tricky because then you're having to eliminate gluten, dairy, and soy,
You're
and
left with so little. Yeah.
you're left with
Yeah,
so
exactly.
little, and you end up, you just, I find people have so many different food sensitivities that grains can be a big thing that people are sensitive, nuts and seeds and nightshades, that I'm just like, the animal protein seems to be the least reactive food for a lot of people with autoimmunity. And so that's what I typically recommend. I will say every time I talk about diet, there's like one or two people that are like, I follow the vegan. I used to be paleo and I went vegan. And that was what turned things around for me. But generally what I say to people is like, if you are doing something and you are sick right now, probably what you're doing is not working, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so let's switch that around. And I would say that to somebody that was gluten free and still had a lot of Hashimoto's inflammation. I would say, you know what, we need to look at beyond just diet. What else is going on, and what else can we do? Because clearly, the vegan diet isn't working for them if they're sick, right?
Right. Stress and lifestyle. I mean, there's so much to put in the little vase, for example, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. There's also, infections. People can have various gut infections,
Right.
and the
So
infections
healing their gut would be the most important thing.
Um, it depends on the person for sure. Like there might be some people that are living in very toxic mold. So getting rid of the mold situation might be their individual trigger.
Mm-hmm.
Other people might have 4 to 5 different gut infections. And so healing their gut infections might be relevant for them. I've had, thousands of people over the last decade plus submit success stories and talk about what worked for them. And I've had people who said it was a root canal that was my root cause, or it was an
Mm.
H. pylori infection, or it was
Yeah.
simply getting off of gluten and dairy, or other people were more complicated. And then there was one person who was like, I didn't have to do anything. I just quit my job, and my job was so toxic and my boss was awful, and that was causing me so much stress that it
Mm.
was causing me to express an autoimmune condition. So it's going to be a little bit different for everybody, but I would say majority of people, support your detox pathways, support
Yeah.
your stress response, and then that gut support too.
Yeah. Yeah. What advice do you have for individuals who are navigating their health journey and, for example, seeking reliable information? Like where they can go and find this word? Because when you Google some stuff, let's say like you Google Hashimoto, there's so many information out there and can get very confusing. What would be your advice where they can look for that information?
It's really tricky because there are like the medical sites that are just very much scrubbed from the from like what really works. So it's very basic. Like if you have Hashimoto's, you need thyroid medications, and there's nothing else you can really do. So that's not necessarily a great source of information. And then there's like the clickbait websites that are sort of like just drink celery juice and you will be healed of everything, right? I'm sure you've seen those websites, and
Yes.
neither is the truth, right? So um, yes, medications can help. Yes, celery juice is delicious and can be great. But the truth is, generally, I would say if you look at PubMed, that is going to be a reliable place of information. And these are published medical journals
Mm-hmm.
that that could share research with you about what's going on in Hashimoto's and what are some of these protocols that are working. So there's research backing selenium being helpful, myoinositol being helpful for getting Hashimoto's into remission. And, I know it's not easy for the average person. So I've collected a lot of the research, I've summarized it, and I've shared my personal experience. And I've written my books, Hashimoto's Protocol, my website, Thyroid Pharmacist. I do strive to make it as accurate and fact checked as possible.
Mm-hmm.
I have a team of research assistants that just help me with citations and making sure everything makes sense and everything is medically accurate as much as it can be, and also drawing on my experience with working with other people. I don't want to like toot my own horn and say like the only go to my website, but really I feel like a lot of times the websites, if they're not tailored to Hashimoto's, they can be very
Mm-hmm.
basic advice that's like everybody should do this, and it's like no, if you have an autoimmune condition, if you have Hashimoto's, these are specific things that can make it worse. These are things that can make it better. And I
Right.
feel like there are, the Institute of Functional Medicine is another reliable source because they really focus on the evidence and the clinical experience of what's actually working, what's been
Right. Okay.
helpful.
Thank you. No, that's a very good information because, like I said, it's very hard when you go and Google something and then you have you can be overwhelmed sometimes. So having people like yourself who are or who have been in this yourself, having all that information is absolutely important. So thank you for sharing that. Really appreciate that. What are some practical steps that my listeners can take to support their thyroid health on everyday basis?
Some of the great things that people can do is supporting their stress response.
Mm-hmm.
So I know people with thyroid issues, they typically struggle with morning fatigue. Making sure that you get sunshine in the morning is going to be a great way to turn this around and to help balance your cortisol levels, which can contribute to thyroid issues. Making sure that you're eating for blood sugar balance, that's going to be protein and fat, and limiting your carb intake can be incredibly helpful for a lot of people. Really finding the things, doing some things that you really love and enjoy throughout the day, finding a way to get rid of stress, whether that's yoga, meditation. I just went to a Tai Chi class for the first time today. These are all great ways to get rid of stress that can really build up and cause you to get into that inflammatory autoimmune fight or flight response. So I would say getting good sleep is also going to be critical. I know few studies have been done in people who work night shift, and they tend to have higher rates of Hashimoto's antibodies. So really focusing on that circadian balance can be the key to not just Hashimoto's, but overall having a healthy stress response will prevent a lot of different health conditions and make even if you're sick, it can make you feel a lot better very quickly.
Right. What about men? Can men also have Hashimoto, or this is only like women?
You typically hear about women having this condition, and for every man that's diagnosed, there are like 2 to 5 women that will be diagnosed. So it's definitely more common in women. I do see it in men as well. The men tend to, I don't know if we got into symptoms as much, but women tend to complain of hair loss, brain fog, fatigue, puffy face, cold intolerance, perhaps some anxiety, constipation, where men, the biggest thing they complain about is libido and having trouble with their muscles, like building their muscles. What happens is that low thyroid hormone can impact testosterone levels. And so a lot of men that are walking around with, low T, actually it could be their thyroid, and correcting their thyroid function can actually correct their testosterone production. So this is something that's very relevant in men for sure, not as common as we see it in women.
Okay. Okay, that's very interesting. Yeah. What are some key takeaways that you hope my listeners will gain from reading, for example, your books? Because I said your books are wonderful.
Thank you. I hope that what they learn is that they can take charge of their own health. I hope that they will learn to identify the signs and symptoms that their bodies are telling them on how to really care for themselves. Because, symptoms like anxiety, for example, could tell us that we're nutrient deficient or that we have blood sugar issues. And then there are symptoms like trouble sleeping and constipation. This could tell you that you're magnesium deficient. And I really hope that people can learn to be their own healers and to learn how to really be in charge of their own health and their own lives.
Any final thoughts that you'd like to share with us?
Definitely, if you have symptoms like brain fog, fatigue, weight gain, cold intolerance, anxiety, multiple miscarriages, if your symptoms started around pregnancy, puberty, or perimenopause, do consider getting a full thyroid panel because it might just be Hashimoto's and hypothyroidism, and getting on the right protocol can be really life-changing.
Well, Thank you so much, Izabella. I really appreciate your time and your expertise to share with us about thyroid/Hashimoto. I think it's very important for people to take that to heart and really take care of their health, especially for women who are, like you mentioned, having these symptoms of brain fog and so on. So, again, I really do appreciate your time and sharing the information with us. Yeah, so thank you again and have a beautiful day.
You as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you.